Hi there, I'm Deep Dillon. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful. Welcome back to your AI Injection. This week we'll be discussing the role of AI in smart commuting with Corey Tucker. Corey received a BA in Civil Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University and an MS in Civil Engineering from MIT. She's now the Director of Innovation at RideAmigos, an online platform seeking to redesign commuting systems to be more sustainable and improve the commuting experience. All right, so Corey, start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got attracted to this idea of the commuting experience and trying to improve it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. It was actually sort of accidental. I'm a big biker and I raced bikes when I was in grad school. I was doing completely different work.
Like what kind of bike? Sorry, I'm a bike nerd, so we're gonna have to interrupt you right there.
I started racing road bikes.
Okay.
I was a grad student at MIT, and for those who don't know, and this will surprise everyone, MIT has an excellent cycling team. Like
that I didn't know. I lived in Cambridge for a number of years, but I did not know.
It's mind-blowing, like national champions out the wazoo, like very, very talented cyclists. And I started road biking. I did a little bit of cyclocross racing. Nowadays I live in Oregon, so I do a lot more mountain biking. It's just bikes are a thing for me. But while I was at grad school, I was doing actually environmental work on mercury poisoning. So that was what I was studying as a grad student. I got into bikes and then I got hit by cars several times.
Ooh.
And that's not just like a bad thing. It's just like shit, we should do something about this, right? Like this is a problem. Let me see.
Anything serious for these like?
No, I got doored a couple times and I got turned into. No like high speed, no high speed incidents or anything. But I was sort of not particularly that interested. I wasn't having a great time in grad school. I wasn't enjoying what I was researching. And my background was in civil engineering. So I'd done some transportation work in the past. So I just basically walked into the civil engineering department one day and was like, hey, are you guys doing anything related to bikes, related to transportation? Could I come over here and could I basically change the direction of my grad school work? Yeah. And they just so happened to have a project that was funded by the Federal Highway Administration at the time that was looking at, can we influence basically people's behavior around how they commute by doing a couple different things. There was a parking component to it. There was an incentive component to it, and a technology component. And I sort of jumped at the opportunity and headed over there. And so I sort of stumbled into this particular space. Mm-hmm. And as much as I care about bike safety and other things, this feels like a good place to be in. It's peripheral, or it's tangential, I guess, to that work. And certainly the less cars we have driving, the less incidents potentially we have with bikes. So it felt like a kind of an easy transition to make. And that sort of started it. And I worked with my company that I work for now as a grad student.
Okay.
And so they sort of plucked me out of grad school when I was done, kind of said, come, you can choose your own path. Come work with us, and you have expertise that we need. And that's how I got to.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit about like, what does your company do? Like, what does it have to do with smart commuting, and what does that mean? Yeah,
absolutely. So my company makes software. Mm-hmm. And the software, we make two pieces of software now. One is a pretty robust kind of like large scale ride matching commute management service or platform. And that one was driven by city and state governments. So for the audience, like city and state governments often have a mandate to provide certain services to their citizens.
Yeah.
And one of those services often is ride matching. So the ability to find a carpool match. Sometimes those services include trying to get less people driving, so to reduce congestion. That can include, other kind of more niche services like guaranteed ride home, where basically they say, if you are willing to carpool to work, we'll make sure that you can get home. And so that was sort of our driving factor.
Yeah. And like here in Seattle, we have all kinds of stuff. There's like the city will actually give you a van
Yeah.
that you can, if you can formulate a carpool, you actually get one, I think. There's like a million things, but yeah, most cities have something going on.
Yeah. And like a carpool of like 4+, you can get access to a van, and there's tax subsidies and all kinds of implications to that. So that's sort of where we started. What I've been working on for the past couple of years is recognizing that while that exists, and that type of product can often serve really large organizations, because large organizations often operate like little cities. I mean, like talking about like big companies in the Bay that have campuses, they operate a little differently, is that, smaller companies also have commuters. And so we now also have an app that's more of a turnkey solution. So it's both to support commuters. One is sort of run by an entity, right? The government or the company runs it. They use it like kind of like Salesforce or other large scale software. They like have to implement things and utilize it to get benefits out of it. And the other is more of a turnkey app that we are kind of leveraging into smaller business spaces, because at the end of the day, a 20-person company still has commuters. They still pay for parking. They still do all that kind of stuff. So they need not be left out in the cold.
And is the core of the app find people to commute with?
The core of the app actually is sort of, yes, I guess the core of the app is that, but it's also the origination of the app was around this idea of, can we personalize someone's commute? So, every app's other services like Netflix, Amazon tell you what to do on a day-to-day basis. They tell you, what to watch, what to buy. Can we actually suggest to you how you should commute, and then help you by finding people for you to commute with? And we do that. We've actually adopted that in a mode agnostic kind of approach. So it's not just carpooling. We find people for you to bike with if you're close enough to bike or walk with or take transit with. And then we offer kind of incentives and gamification on top of that to keep the app sticky and make people engage with it a little bit more.
So where's the AI piece? Is it in the recommendation engines to try to identify like who you're compatible with? Let's just start there. Or are there other places as well, beyond the recommendation engine?
Sure. So there's a couple of places where we leverage machine learning primarily, but the recommendation engine is certainly an area, right? So it's not just to sort of help determine who you're compatible with, but the day of the fixed schedule is pretty much out the window. So it's also to sort of try to gain insights about how people actually commute on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. So if you have patterns like gym attendance on Tuesdays and Thursdays or other things, like we want to be able to pick up on that. And I guess this gets to the other kind of area where we use AI is we actually use passive tracking. So we'll use the sensors on your phone, of course, assuming you've given us permission to do that. We use the sensors on your phone and other things to like determine how you commuted. And that's how we reward folks. That obviously, has to leverage some amount of machine learning to determine even what mode you've taken and all of that kind of stuff. But beyond that, we're trying to recognize patterns in your commute. So we're trying to recognize, do you take your kids to school on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays and go to the gym Tuesdays and Thursdays? And does that change the recommendation? Because in the past, or in the more rudimentary form of this, right, all we know is that you leave your home and you need to get to work and you need to do it every single day, or 3 days a week by a certain time. And if we don't have any information about how you do that, or how sensitive you are to weather changes or other things, our recommendations and our matches start to become pretty useless, because like your circumstances change on a regular basis. And so we're trying,
just traffic or something like Google now is like, hey, there's a traffic jam on your commute home, that kind of thing. I imagine you probably have to deal with.
Yeah, traffic, transit delay. I mean, like anything, right? I used to live in DC. People, I hate to say this, people would jump in front of the trains a lot, or like stuff happened like on the metro, and the metro would be shut down, and I'd be sitting at the train station waiting. So all kinds of stuff.
So I imagine, in addition to your own sort of direct data you have, like with respect to who's matched with whom and what that individuals are doing, it sounds to me like you have to also triangulate some external data sources. So, like whatever is telling you that somebody jumped in front of a train, like the traffic sources. So how do you source that data, and how do you think about it in the context of your company?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest with you, this is an area that is actually probably one of the more difficult ones, because it's data that we in some ways sort of can create for ourselves, but we do access other data sources. So traffic is sort of, I don't want to say it's an easy one, but like it's sort of a straightforward one, right? Google offers that, like a lot of entities out there that do mapping or routing offer real-time traffic stuff, and that's at least a place to start. You have an organization like Waze that has historically done this idea of crowdsourcing information about what's going on the roads. That's something we obviously could also implement. So like there's ways to do that. Where holes exist more often than not is in the transit space. Transit agencies don't have a centralized repository for data, nor do they have like a kind of like a fixed way to represent their data. And so, when you're
I know this really well. I used to be the CTO at Socrata, and most of the data that you're getting there is all piped through our systems.
Yeah.
And we had a massive heterogeneity problem. Like the data is super, it's all over the place. And they're, like depending on the kinds of, because like municipalities generate their own data, and due to the layering in our federalist government structure, you've got federal government, whose data sets are typically quite normalized and geo-fenced, if you will, based on census codes or zip codes, et cetera. But municipal data, I mean, some of this stuff goes back to the pioneer era in terms of like how they classified traffic crimes, or and it like mapping it to something sensible and common is something that sort of sounds straightforward and easy, but ends up being really tedious and challenging.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and all the data sources are separate, right? So like anytime we go, into a new space or a new city, it's hard sometimes to track that down, especially if we start serving rural or suburban areas. Like that's, those might be a couple bus lines in the middle of nowhere, right? It's not sophisticated. There's certainly not a centralized data store. And actually, remarkably, we work in Europe quite a bit, and some European countries are great, and some European countries are really stingy about they just don't want to. Their data is even harder to access, and it's not as well done. And it blows my mind because our data in the U.S. for transit is so bad that like it can be worse.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of companies doing things, like selling services to cities, with sensors on the buses, for example, so that the buses can be tracked and they can, and we can sort of have like a full real-time map. But any company that sells that to anything to a city is not typically guaranteed to sell it to all the cities. And so, you wind up with, at your best case scenario, 2 or 3 vendors, but oftentimes it can be split and fractured even further.
Yeah.
Some of the more endowed cities will have their own technology groups in-house that will go off and try to solve these problems, and then they'll wind up getting somewhere, and then you wind up with a pretty fractured landscape.
Yeah, it's interesting, and actually similar problems too with like parking vendors, right? We work with parking vendors because like we want to know how occupied the parking spaces are, especially if we're working with a company that like has a parking entity. Maybe they own their own parking lots. There's so many parking vendors, so like it's not, and there's no specific way. It just becomes kind of a mess at all times. But yeah, it's interesting, I guess, that you say like that. Sometimes they decide to take it in-house, and I feel like oftentimes that doesn't work out that well either. It just becomes messier every time.
I'm almost wondering, like, is anyone trying to force some centralization here? Because everyone kind of benefits from some consolidation and centralization of the data, but at the same time, everyone's trying to maintain their individual advantages from their data. So like, if I think about Seattle, like we've got every fruit flavored bicycle color of bike share that you could imagine has been here. It's gotten so bad that by the time you fill it out and get your app going and you write a few, then they're gone and there's a new one. And there's like, we've been through probably 8 or 9. Then there's the scooters and the bikes and then the moped looking things. And then there's the car shares that are there one day and gone the next. I kind of feel like the cities need to force some sort of like, if you want to run your share app in our city, you got to plug into this common infrastructure, and it's got to adhere to these schemas and and this sort of latency budget, et cetera. And you can keep a little bit to be private, but mostly we just want it all. Like,
no.
Have you seen any kind of movement like that, or something actually happening there?
It's actually funny that you say that, because I've made this comment many times. It's and I think you recognize one of the issues quite well, which is that like there is a power dynamic associated, particularly when you start talking about these third-party mobility providers, like, you know, Bird, when you're talking about bikes, obviously, like Bird, Lime, whatever, Lyft, Scooter's the same, but like, even with like Lyfts and Ubers, and where like, they don't care, right? They have enough money, they have enough leverage that they don't really want to play ball in that regard. And I do think that cities, at the end of the day, have basically one of the only levers, which is to say, like, you cannot operate in our city if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, like in Seattle, they're very hard about it. Like everyone has to renew once a year.
Yeah.
And so, because that keeps the lever in the hands of the city, because there's just like an evolution of new problems. Like, I mean, it used to be the bikes they had no batteries or anything. And then they were just like sprawled out all over the place, deemed relatively useless in a hilly city like Seattle. So people started throwing them off the bridge or putting them, like hanging them upside down, making sculptures out of them. Then they started putting batteries on them. And then people started grabbing the batteries and doing stuff with those. Or just knocking them down. Then there were scooters, and there's just always something going on. So they realized that they can't force compliance of their regulations unless they can hang something really big and heavy over these vendors. And it just feels to me like there's a federal and even international role to be played here, that there's an ecosystem of data that we really need centralized, because at the end of the day, society is not trying to solve the green bike problem. Society is trying to figure out ultimately it's the carbon reduction problem in large part, something bigger. You know, I'm curious if you see any progress there.
There are groups certainly that are doing work like this. There's a group that we have done some work with. That's kind of a global sustainability group. It's called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But at the end of the day, like, these are just working groups that are making suggestions, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that, I mean, I don't want to comment on the status of our lovely federal government and how much of a crapshoot it is, but like, you know, it's low priority for them. So like they're doing things like leveraging, you know, funds through the DOT, like the federal DOT or the Federal Highway Administration, to do research projects, but they kind of don't go anywhere, right? They go to, we're not going to do anything with this, so how can you guys do something with this? And so like anyone that gets granted those funds, you know, has to say like, well, this is how I'm going to commercialize, this is how I'm going to make this sustainable, you know, going forward into the long run. And the federal government will fund it for a few years and then kind of walk away.
Need help with computer vision, natural language processing, automated content creation, conversational understanding, time series forecasting, customer behavior analytics? Reach out to us at zyonix.com. That's XYONIX.com. Maybe we can help.
I think like there isn't a clear like understanding that this can have an impact. I think like perhaps climate is, you know, I mean,
you mentioned like the DOT, and I think that's like a good analogy, because like in the crime world, the FBI has a lot of levers, and to the extent that we have normalized crime data, it's put out and sort of forced by the FBI. Actually, this you can generalize this to any data that goes down to municipal, county. It's different layers of government, state levels. Is that there exists a federal agency that had some kind of leverage and resources to force some nationalization, like the National Education Administration puts out probably the best national data sets around school systems. Like, you know, every school's in there, high school, middle, elementary, and then they're all like geofenced within various census boundaries. I'm thinking like that this is really pretty much the DOT's arena. And the question is, can they incentivize all these various layers of government to like force something like this to happen?
I mean, I guess like what I'm curious about, and I'd be interested like your thoughts on this, especially like as you're referencing the FBI or like the education, you know, is like the FBI makes sense to me, right? Because if they get centralized data, like they potentially get to do something with it. The DOT is unlikely to leverage this data themselves. So they'd be making basically states, cities, municipalities, whatever, do some, and I guess private, micro mobility providers, et cetera, do something that doesn't necessarily serve the DOT. Like
Well, I would push back on that. Like, because if
Yeah.
you think about like the NEA, with respect to like education as an example, they have to report up.
Yeah.
So every administration has an education policy, and they have metrics that they get to track. Bureau of Economic Analysis, same thing. Like they're basic, first and foremost, tasked with like measuring the state of the nation for a thing, education, for the for the economy, et cetera. And then that data is typically the most respected data in the country for the thing. And then at a minimum, administrations have to talk about how they're performing relative, it's because that's where those numbers that wind up in the news that we talk about come from. And, research is benchmarked against these numbers. So I would argue that DOT, like if the Biden administration said, look, DOT, you have to tell us, like if they painted a specific vision here saying, we want all transportation, whether it's public, private, or sort of public-private partnerships, we need all that data reflected. And then they enumerated what it was. And this is probably the hard part. And they said, we withhold traffic, traffic related funds if you don't do these things or have a plan to get to them. There is precedence for it. Like, it can happen. It's just, it requires political will, which,
exactly. I guess like that's sort of like what I'm wondering is like, 100% they could do that. I don't disagree with you at all. I'm thinking like,
where does the will come from?
Like the public, I guess, debatably, right? Cares about the state of education in the United States. Like we have kids, we want our kids to be educated, et cetera. Other than, and like this, it's comical because it sort of, I guess, wraps back around to like whether or not we can have an influence on commuters. Other than like my drive into the office every single day, if I read like the traffic in LA is terrible, and these are the metrics, or like this is, the data about micromobility, like I care because I'm in the industry, but like as a normal human, I'm just not sure that we care. If we can't get ourselves to care about like, unless we frame it in sustainability terms, and even then I'm skeptical because we don't seem to care that much about, pollution from other sources or landfills or, any number.
Well, it's not easy, right? Because on the left and right, you have very different sort of belief systems around what matters to them. But I think you'd have to somehow speak to them. You'd have to like speak in a way that made sense. Like on the left, I think, creating an ecosystem where, carbon reduction is like a core principle probably will work, or could, stands a good chance. On the right, you have to find something that the right cares about. So like commute times might be one, that is the struggle. I mean, like I remember in a lot of the cities I was dealing with in Europe had very different orders of magnitudes of budget. Like I remember working closely with like Bristol in England, and I mean, they had a couple of orders of magnitude more money to spend on problems. And so some of those places almost went into a different problem space where they had so much money to spend that they didn't focus on just what government should do. They started falling into like what we would think of as private companies filling the gaps, and they would start to imagine like excessively fantastical scenarios in a way.
That happens here too, honestly.
Yeah, maybe, because it is more fun to think about that stuff than it is to talk about like the mundane,
Yeah, and there is more money. I think there's especially after, I don't want to say after COVID, because like every time anyone says that, it makes me want to like yell. It's not exactly, there's no after. But like after the past couple of years where people are now, I guess, sort of going back to work, and there was a pretty big outlay to the Department of Transportation once, but like there has been a bigger outlay to DOT in the Buttigieg Biden, period. There's money, right? And we talk a lot to government agencies.
Oh, there's big bucks like
that are rolling in money, and all of a sudden they have no idea what to do, right? So like there is sort of now this disconnect where like they have more money than they know what to do with, and
they have this kind of like naive way of spending it. I mean, I feel like it's very 1972. It's like, oh, we're gonna have shovel ready projects and we're just gonna start building roads and bridges and fixing roads and bridges. And I'm not saying that those are bad things to do. We may need to fix roads and bridges, and but it just feels very like not reflective of the reality of all of this energy in the private sector that's trying to address the last mile commute problems, that's trying to do it in ways that, that shake up the usual political dynamic. But I feel like the political conversation doesn't really keep up with the reality of who's actually trying to solve these problems. And then there's just gaps because the private sector just doesn't want to deal with the non-profitable parts of the space.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I will say, like, we do have crumbling infrastructure. So like there is something to be said for like, we have to fix some of it. But, one of the things that I think about a lot is the industry that I operate in is this industry that is generally called TDM. It's transportation demand management. But a lot of people in my space and outside of it have started to really just sort of contextualize that as meaning like, we want less cars, right? We want less people driving, and like, of course we want less cars, but we do have a certain supply of infrastructure, right? And so like, for me, when I think about actually where the outlays of carbon come from and other things and sustainability as a whole, like one of my goals also is just like, let's not build more infrastructure if we can avoid it, right? Maybe we build more transit or other things, but like, I don't want to build more roads just to like address that problem of demand, right? So it's not just for me, like,
or widening them. I mean, we're kind of in Seattle here, we're doing the opposite, like we're narrowing roads.
Like
in a lot of cases. So
if we could use the roads more optimally, we'd be a little bit better off, right? So like, we have a certain amount of supply of infrastructure. If we could optimize our use of it, I think that's a good step that doesn't necessarily make it feel like we're just sort of shoving this idea of don't drive down everyone's throats. It could be that we spread it out a little bit and we're not as hard on the roads and we don't have as much congestion. There's so many externalities associated with how people get around. And there's a lot of externalities with the work to do to widen roads or build new roads or, build new bridges. That, if we could avoid that as a first step, it's kind of like what I think about a lot is like, how can we spread people out around like over the modes that they could be using, not just be like, don't use a car at all costs, because that really is a turnoff to a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's also a bit of a red herring. Like, not all cars are created equal. I mean, do I really care if a car is full and electric and getting power from a green source? Like, I don't know that I care at that point. I mean, there's just like multiple factors. There's like the environmental carbon footprint issue. There's the social equity issues of just having mobility and having access to it. So changing the topic back to AI a little bit. So let's go, like, thinking about AI and like the lens that we've kind of like covered in the transportation arena. Like, if you had to name a handful of use cases, if you will, where some machine learning can like really make a difference, like what do those arenas look like from your vantage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of lowest hanging fruit from my perspective is this idea of, can we pretty accurately determine when people are using certain modes, using certain like routes? And obviously, to a certain extent, the route piece doesn't necessarily involve AI, but the mode certainly does, if we want to be sure that they did it and not have them tell us a certain thing, right? So it's quite hard. Walking, biking, things that your phone picks up on pretty easily are pretty easy. The phone sensors are pretty accurate at picking up on that. The patterns are pretty common, the way that your legs spin, the way that you walk, etc. Where we really struggle is, and I'll get into why this is important for us in a minute, but where we really struggle is like understanding, once you're in a motorized mode, are you in a car by yourself? Are you in a carpool? Are you in a van pool? Are you in a shuttle bus or a train? Those things are actually quite hard to determine. And that's where, really robust machine learning and large data sets are going to become important, or are already important for us. And the reason that from my vantage point is important is because, in our space, a lot of people offer incentives, they offer tax subsidies, they offer the ability to use lanes or go through carpool, or go through like different toll lanes and all kinds of stuff that has an impact on how people perceive their commute, right? Or share rides or do other things.
How are you doing that right now? I mean, are you just tapping into the mic and listening for conversations and like doing some speaker diarization or something to figure out?
We actually work with a third party that does pretty robust has a pretty robust mode detection. they generally are able to differentiate between like a car versus a shuttle or like something that has a moderately fixed route. Now,
yeah, because you're going to see the same route and
you're
you're
going to
going
see
to
the
see
same route. You're
stops.
going to be able to
So,
match the route, like
so you might be able to get
acceleration out of the stop, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Plus, they move slower. Like a bus moves way slower than a car
Yeah.
typically.
Interestingly, we still run into issues with this in Europe because they have these like long distance, high speed bus routes that look much more like a car. So it is not,
they also,
it's not always a perfect solution.
And they also just think it through a little bit more, like their buses can like move and
bus rapid transit, etc. But where we really struggle right now is carpooling. So to your point, and I think that's an interesting point that you bring up about mics and other things. We do try to limit how many sensors we access on people's devices because anytime
battery.
But anytime you have to ask for more permissions, people are inherently skeptical. Permissions are something that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. We had a meeting about it today. People yelled at each other. It's fine. But like, accessing sensors is difficult. What we do now is mostly sort of trying to match routes, much like a transit route does. But like if we try to like pick up on who you're carpooling with most frequently or who you're, van pulling with most frequently, can we actually match the route that you took with those folks? So,
I see.
That's less AI machine learning than we would pick up on. This is motorized, right? Like there's kind of levels to this. Like we leverage the machine learning into you're in a car, and then we'd say like, okay, these are the people that you most often carpool with, and we'd look at like arrival times, departure times, and then like you kind of narrow down until you get like, we think these two people probably did, and then you look at routes and other things.
And then you probably also think these two probably should. Because they're
one
leaving like 5 minutes apart and they're in a couple of blocks of each other.
Yeah, I mean, one of the pieces of the app itself is that it matches people, right? So like part of it is if we say like the app told you and I to carpool together, and we're chatting with each other already. Like we know that we're chatting. We're gonna suspect basically if we did that you and I are carpooled together, and then we would have a reason to check our routes against each other. So we are sort of. It's kind of it's like a whittling process. It's not the entire breadth of the number of people. Like I'm not going to drive to the other side of LA to pick up someone. It's unlikely unless they're
but yeah, like you're looking for, some like radius around two people's starting point, end point, and time of departure and return.
Yes.
Presumably.
And also like our ability, because we have chat built in, the ability for us to monitor the chat too, right? So like we can pick up on, did you guys exchange chats this morning right before the commute, or maybe last night? Was there activity in your chat feed? All kinds of little pieces of information.
And you can probably, it may be not across all cases, but you can judiciously like get some explicit feedback where they just tell you, yeah, that's a fellow carpooler, so that you can train some models off of that. Do you do that sort of thing too?
Yeah, we're trying to sort of phase that out a little bit. In our early versions of the app, we had people sort of self-report so that we had a data set. So that like we could confirm, then we basically had a test and train data set. We could use it to assess whether or not we were doing a good job. But we still do that periodically, but we've sort of tried to phase that out a little bit. So it is we're kind of launching in a broader way. So we don't want to have people having to feel like they're reporting all the time.
Have data, have a hypothesis on some high value insights that, if extracted automatically, could transform your business? Not sure how to proceed? Bounce your ideas off one of our data scientists with a free consult. Reach out at zionics.com. You'll talk to an expert, not a salesperson.
Yeah, I imagine with an app like this, how people engage and what they do is probably a constant challenge.
It's really hard. It's like edge cases that you could never possibly expect, like that's, I think, and that's the challenge, right? The challenge is people are different. People's schedules change on a day-to-day basis, but there are often patterns, right? So like, it is not really common my mother maybe is the great exception, and she'll love me when she listens to this later, but get up, go to work at the same place every day at the exact same time, leave work at the same time every day. And
especially now post-pandemic.
Pretty much go home, but that's like, it's not a thing anymore. I mean, like people go to happy hour, people, there's so many things, but there are patterns, right? And so if we can get close enough.
So what happened? So I always love talking to folks about what happened to their data pre and post pandemic. So your data must have gone a little wackadoodle if you were mostly catering to, urban core office workers who are like, living in denser areas. And then all of a sudden, nobody's even going to the office. And all of a sudden you must have, March 2020, seen your data just go off a cliff or something. And
Yeah.
so like what happened then? And like, what's like reconnecting now, and what's different and new?
Yeah, I mean, March 2020 is like the day that we were like, our job is done. We've done our job, and
yeah, because everyone's staying home. So like, yeah, carbon not being emitted, everyone's sitting at home.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful. No, that was a terrible moment, but I mean, I think even to the thing that we're discussing, right? Like, I don't work in an office now, and I've been a remote worker for a while, but when I graduated from college, I lived in DC, and I went into the office every day. I took transit. And even then, like, my schedule wasn't necessarily fixed, but it was way more fixed than people are experiencing now. And I think there's a couple things that we're noticing, and these are more industry trends that are reflected in the data, but is that, like, while people had flexibility in how they got to work and what they did afterwards and before the pandemic, most people had pretty fixed schedules. Like, most people still, there was like this expectation that you're in the office around 9 or, whatever, depending on where you worked. And there was this expectation that you worked until 5 or 6 or 7 and you went home, right? And it was pretty much every day.
Yeah.
Now, like, back to work policies are just like, they're crazy across the board. But more often than not, what they are is like, most companies are like, please come in a couple days a week, right? And so what we're seeing is, and this is something that has not a lot to do with data, but sort of a little bit to do with transportation, is like something that we used to really advocate for when we talk to companies is like, you need to introduce flexibility in how your people, like a little bit around time, but also in like, don't charge them for an annual parking permit. Don't lock them into things. You need to introduce flexibility so that people can make good decisions on a day-to-day basis, because everyone's reality is different on a day-to-day basis. People have kids, people go to the gym, people do all these things. If you lock them into a certain way of getting to work, you're going to have your parking lot's going to be full every single day, because basically you've made someone pay for a parking permit for a year, and that's just bad policy. We're coming out of that where employers are sort of being forced into that, right? They're being forced into this, like, my employees are only coming in 2 days a week. They hate it. We have to make it as flexible as possible. They can come in, at whatever time they want and go home at whatever time they want. And in a way, it's sort of helped us because we designed some of our products to really try to feed into that flexibility. So we are seeing people go in at all kinds of times. We're seeing people, go in usually on a set schedule, but like definitely like not every day, maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or what have you. More flexibility around that. I will say though that and this is common, everyone knows this, transit ridership and other things like that have definitely dropped off because people are nervous. It's ticked back up, but it hasn't reached pre-pandemic levels by any stretch of the imagination. So in the data, what we're seeing is like people driving more, but also people biking more, people walking more, because they got used to doing that kind of stuff during the pandemic time. A lot of people got outside and
oh yeah, my
and
mountain bike trails are like packed now.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I've had the funniest conversations with people. Well, I used to just sit in coffee shops all the time, and now I go riding. But anyway, so we have this phenomenon, and I have a few friends that like have businesses with outdoor apparel, and it's just like that whole world has just grown. Terrific to get people outside in a level that they haven't before, but yeah, very confusing from somebody sitting around looking at data and trying to figure out what's going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like hard for those of us who are hobbyists to be like, oh, my trails are all full. But like at the same time, if I can convince the companies that we work with to leverage that into a back to work strategy, that's like, we're going to raffle off 10 really nice bikes to get you guys, whatever.
I feel I don't know, this is a bit of a side note. It's not like quite on the AI bucket, but the model to getting people into the office is just really not that complicated. Like every graduate school in the world has a simple model. There's a place, you come when you want and you don't when you don't. And as long as you make it interesting and fun, and there's a reason to come, which is namely like other people are there and want to be there, and it's quiet, and it's a good place to work, then no problem. People show up. Going back to the machine learning thing though. You mentioned this idea of being able, there's like certain problems in RideAmigos that you think are kind of challenging from a machine learning vantage, probably due to like your kind of availability of the types of data you've got. But if we step out of that particular context and think about it more from like a city's vantage, like what do you think are the big machine learning problems there that like really matter? Like what is a great vision that we could have and work towards that's sort of digestible by, you know, somebody who doesn't do any of this stuff at a party on a Friday night?
Yeah, and I don't think it's everyone or no one ever, you know, with a vehicle. I think, you know, you made a good point before, which is like some of these entities like Lyft and Uber potentially like use electric cars or use other, you know, less emitting vehicles. And I think in some ways that's really good. But I do think, and I want to just like circle back on this idea, like, and we have the same problem. I think that the cities have this problem at a almost like a higher level, which is that like they can't solve all the problems, right? Like we talked about this earlier, like, and they don't even often solve, you know, the transit problems, but they fund a lot of these things. But at the end of the day, you know, you have your first mile, you have your middle, you have your last mile, you were getting around to a lot of different places. And I think this concept around like, can we do a little bit more to sort of guide people and how they make their decisions, and then use all of the data. If we could aggregate all of this data from all of these different entities, from the micromobility providers, from transit, from vehicles, we could do a better job of optimizing people's experience. So like what I'm thinking at the end of like the like dream, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it could, I'm not saying it's our app, but like some like your watch or whatever is like, I know your calendar, right? I know that you are like going to get up at this time, whatever, you're going to go to the gym, you're going to go to work, you're going to go to happy hour, you're going to go home. And like your device or your phone or whatever can basically guide you through your day in the most optimal way possible. So if the optimal is for you to walk to the gym because it's down the street, and then take this bus from the gym to your place of work. And in some cases that is going to be, you are going to drive your car. In some cases that's going to be, you're going to drive your car and pick someone else up. But at the end of the day, we can't do that if we don't aggregate all of these data sources. And then like so I think the place that cities and municipalities have to play in this is, one, trying to enforce that kind of data collaboration, that collaboration across all of these entities.
Yeah, so, and I would also, I mean, I would argue like if like one of the things I kind of can't stand about the bus system is like nobody can tell me when the stupid bus is going to get there. And this is like an utterly trivially solvable problem. Yes. I mean, we just duct tape a $10 Android device to the top of the bus. I mean, and problem solved. Like it's not a hard problem.
Yes, on the bus regardless.
Yeah, like it's just, I mean, I've literally thought about just duct taping like, you know, an Android device on the inside of a bumper of a bus so I can know when the hell it's going to get there every day.
The more people have bad experiences using transit or using other things, the less likely they're going to do it, right?
Totally.
And so like all of these things add up to being bad experiences. And so,
and they're not in Europe, or even like when I lived in Boston, this wasn't a problem because like
heavy rail. Easier.
Yeah, heavy rail was a problem, but like the T was great. Like you go down plus or minus 5 minutes, but like, you know, like taking the local train in Oslo, it's plus or minus a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, if that, I mean, it's there when it says it's going to be there, but not in America generally, outside of maybe New York, Boston, a few cities. It's like
maybe, but even then it's just like, actually, it's probably not. It's just that they're running on such short headways that it's fine. Right. Yeah. So like you're going at rush hour, they're running on 3 to 5 minute headways. And of course, like you feel like that's fine because you're not counting on a time. You're counting on the fact that you can walk into the station and there will be a train that comes in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah, which is what I want to do because I mean, I'll be blunt. I don't want to reach in my pocket and pull my stupid phone out to like figure out how to get somewhere. And I'm like, I want to be an autopilot. I just want to go. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to ask you one final question. Paint me a picture 10 years into the future where everything goes perfectly and AI systems are able to route riders to ride, like to ride shares. There's machine learning able to maybe figure out who can go where, when. Like, what's the perfect scenario for me and as an individual, or for somebody else, or you as an individual, where you can like wake up in the morning, I don't know, what do? You check your phone, you walk outside, you get on a thing, you get to your work. Like, how is your life better? And like, what does that life look like?
Yeah, I'm a little bit, I'm just gonna caveat this by saying that I'm a little bit of a behind the times human. Like I still read books and don't have a Kindle, etc. So like, I don't want to believe that we'll have like high tech glasses that you wear that tell you like, where to go all the time. But I, you know, what I think that looks like is you get up in the morning. You know, we have become a, you know, zero car, maybe one car per family country. You know, your watch or your smartphone tells you when to leave your house, like what time to leave your house to get to the bus stop in time for the bus that will be there on time, for example. That takes you to work. There's Wi-Fi on the bus, so you can get 30 minutes of work done on the bus. So maybe you get to leave 30 minutes earlier, or maybe even an hour earlier if you're going to do 30 minutes of like, we've created a situation where your commute time is productive time. When you go to leave work, you know, your device or otherwise also tells you to take a different bus to pick up your kid at school. You meet your kid and you walk the rest of the way home. So it's, you know, I don't want to say like, it sounds like I want people's lives to be dictated. What I want is them not to have to, one, drive their car every day, but in order to not do that, I don't want them to have to think about all the other options and kind of dive through them. I think one of the places that I see issues is that people drive their cars every day because it's the easiest thing. They don't have to think about it. They can just drive and park, right? And the activation energy of considering other things is high. Yeah. And so what I would like to do, you know, what I would like to see is that we can sort of remove that activation energy, that people generally have good experiences doing the thing that, you know, whatever it is, your device, your watch, whatever tells you to do. So you take transit, it's on time. Now, of course, there's so many things that go into this, but like you are enjoying your experience, you're not stuck in traffic, you're having a more productive time during your commute time. Your employer takes that into account. And so like, you don't have to stay at work an extra hour. And you get to have more, you know, quality time at home and a better work-life balance, and you don't lose time during that period.
So I was kind of thinking you might do something crazy and say, oh, I don't really think we're going to have any buses because there's going to be self-driving cars.
I think they're going to be electric buses, but I don't think, and maybe there will be self-driving cars, but I don't believe that solves our problem, right? The density of cars.
But does it? Let's say two things happen. A, cars are self-driving, you know, within reason, like, you know, maybe not in a hurricane or something, but they're self-driving in like reasonably predictable scenarios. And let's say that two, they're totally electric. And let's say in that world, your rideshare algorithm is like figuring out how to like route smaller pods of vehicle. Like you don't even necessarily need to own, at least you can still meet maybe you just have your own car to get out of the city or something, but like you press a button on your app, Uber shows up, you know, or Lyft, but it's electric and there's no driver and there's already 2 or 3 people in there because it's already figured out who's going to drop off whom where, and the costs drop, and you walk out, and now I don't have to figure out how to get on my bus, and I don't have to figure out any of that other stuff. I just have to walk out my door, get in, and go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I do think it's probably more of a micromobility solution than a self-driving. Like, so, and maybe, you know, there's no reason to say that a bus couldn't be self-driving or a van couldn't be self-driving, right? So like, yeah. I guess I don't see, right now what I see is that we're moving in that direction for smaller vehicles. I don't see that solving that many of the problems, because I think some of the issue with carpooling will transfer over to that, which is that people don't like this sharing. There's this cultural norm around sharing a ride when you're on a bus that doesn't exist around sharing a ride when you're in a car. And while a self-driving car,
you're talking about the trust issue, because you're in a car, it's a smaller space, you have to,
just a smaller space, you have to interact. There's a feeling that you have to interact with people where you don't have to interact with people in transit, I think is sort of one of the driving things, right? If you and I were going to carpool and I got in the passenger seat, or wait, even better, you picked me up and I got in the back seat and just sat there the whole time, that would be a little awkward. Whereas like there's this expectation when you get on a bus or transit that you don't have to interact with any of the people, you can have your headphones in and it's all good. And while I see I hear what you're saying, and I fully see that like a self-driving car could sit firmly in the middle of those two things. There's a little bit of a culture shift that would have to occur that's not just technological.
Well, thanks a
No.
ton. I feel like we covered a lot of good terrain. This has been a lot of fun.
That is all for this episode of your AI injection. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode on AI and smart commuting, please feel free to tell your friends about us, give us a review, and check out our past episodes at podcast.zionics.com. That's podcast.xyonix.com. That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dylan, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at zionics.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.